my daughter-in-law told me to sign everything over or leave. So I called my accountant. I sat at the foot of my own dining room table, the table I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago, looking at the people I still stubbornly called my family. The room was dead silent. It was the kind of thick, heavy silence that settles over a room right before something breaks that can never be put back together. The roast was still steaming on the good china. The candles Eleanor used to light every Sunday flickered against the dark windows, but all I could hear was the slow, steady drumming of my own heart. My wife had been gone barely a year, and already the wolves had decided the old man was finished. The whole family was there that night, the way Eleanor had always insisted the family gather on Sundays. My son Daniel sat halfway down one side, hunched in his chair like a man waiting for a doctor to tell him bad news. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, sat directly across from me at the far end, in the chair Eleanor used to occupy, which was a knife I felt slide in a little deeper every single week. And my granddaughter, Sophie, 16 years old, and the only truly innocent soul in that room, sat quietly beside me, pushing her food around her plate, sensing the way children always sense it, that something ugly was coiled under the surface of the evening. I want you to understand the room, because the people who tell these stories always skip the room, and the room is where you feel the truth of a thing. The dining room I built with my own hands the year Daniel was born, the long table I'd sanded and stained across 3 cold weekends in a rented garage, the tall windows Eleanor had picked out because she wanted to watch the snow fall while we ate, her candlesticks, her good china, the set with the little blue flowers, which we only ever used on Sundays because she said everyday plates were for everyday people, and this family was going to be something more than that. All of it was still exactly where she left it, and now the people sitting among her things had decided her things belonged to them. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, rose from her chair with a calm, rehearsed grace. She did not look like a woman sharing a family meal. She looked like a card player laying down a hand she had been holding for years. She reached down beside her plate, lifted a thick manila folder, and set it flat on the linen cloth right next to my dinner. The soft, deliberate slap of it against the table was louder than any shout could have been. She smiled at me. It was a cold, patient smile, the smile of someone who believes they have already won. "Harold," she said, her voice smooth as poured cream. "It's time. Sign everything over to Daniel and me, or find somewhere else to live. This house, the company, all of it. You're 72 years old, and you're grieving, and you can't keep pretending you're still in charge. Sign, or you're out by the end of the month." The words hung in the candlelit air. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. Outside, the wind pushed against Eleanor's tall windows. Sophie's fork stopped moving. She looked from her mother to me with the wide, frightened eyes of a child who has just watched an adult say something that can never be unsaid. I did not answer right away. I let the silence stretch because I have learned across 72 years that silence frightens the guilty far more than shouting ever could. A man who yells has lost control. A man who goes quiet has only just begun to think. I looked at my son Daniel, sitting to her right. He did not look at me. He looked down at his fork, turning it slowly over in his fingers, as if it were the most fascinating object he had ever seen. 44 years old, wearing a sweater I had paid for, eating off his mother's china, and still too much of a coward to meet his own father's eyes. I waited for him to speak. I gave him a long, full moment to be a man, to put a hand on his wife's arm and say, "Vanessa, that's enough. This is my father." He said nothing. He just kept turning that fork over and over, and in that small, cowardly gesture, I saw the whole shape of what my son had become. They thought they had me completely cornered. They truly believed a lonely old widower would simply fold, sign the papers, and shuffle quietly off to a rented room somewhere to wait for death. But they had forgotten one very important thing. They had forgotten exactly who built the roof they were sitting under, and exactly whose name was on every single deed that mattered. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not so much as raise my voice. I simply set my napkin gently beside my plate, folded my hands, and smiled back at her. It was not a smile of surrender, though she read it that way. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed the last piece of evidence he needed, because in demanding I sign everything over, Vanessa had just told me, in front of the whole family, that she did not know the one thing that would destroy her. She did not know that there was nothing to sign. "That was a wonderful meal, Vanessa," I said quietly. "Thank you for cooking. I think I'll turn in early. It's been a long week and I'm tired." I reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand under the table, just once, so she'd know that whatever was happening, she was not part of it. Then I stood, pushed in my chair the way Eleanor had taught me 40 years ago, because she couldn't stand a pushed-out chair, and I walked out of the room while the whole table sat frozen, waiting for the old man to crumble. He did not crumble. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, playing the tired old widower right up until his bedroom door clicked shut. And then, alone in the dark, he stood up straight, and his hands did not shake at all. He did not sleep much that night. He lay in the bed he had shared with Eleanor for 41 years, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low murmur of his son and daughter-in-law conspiring in the room below, and he planned. And the next morning, before the coffee had even finished brewing, he picked up the phone and called his accountant. Before I tell you what those ownership records said when Marcus read them out loud, and before I tell you exactly how I dismantled the people who tried to put their own father out on the street, do me one small favor. Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you have ever been underestimated by the very people who should have loved you most, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is a story about what happens when the quiet man everyone wrote off finally decides to speak. To understand how we ended up around that silent table, you have to go back a little further than that Sunday. You have to go back to the day I lost the only person who ever truly stood beside me. The house was too quiet now. That was the first thing I noticed every single morning when I woke up. 41 years of marriage, and Eleanor had filled every corner of this place with sound. The clink of her coffee spoon against the side of the mug, the radio she kept low in the kitchen, tuned to the old songs, her humming, always half a note off key, drifting up the stairs while she watered the plants in the window, the particular creak of the third stair under her foot when she came up to bed at night. I had spent 4 decades barely hearing those sounds, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. And then the cancer came, quiet and patient and cruel. And in 8 brutal months, it took all of it away, one sound at a time, until the last thing left was the machine in the hospice room, and then even that went quiet. Now the house was just a large, echoing box, and I rattled around inside it like a single dry seed in an empty jar. Grief does a strange thing to time. Some mornings I would reach across the bed before I was fully awake, and my hand would find cold sheets, and I would remember all over again, fresh as the first day. I still poured 2 cups of coffee some mornings, out of 40 years of habit. And then I would stand there looking at the second cup steaming on the counter with no one to drink it. I kept her reading glasses on the little table by the window because I could not make my hands throw them away. People tell you grief gets lighter. That is not quite true. You do not get a lighter grief. You get stronger shoulders. But that first year my shoulders were not strong yet, and my family knew it, and they decided that a man with a heavy heart is a man who cannot see what is being taken from him. They were wrong about that. A heavy heart does not make you blind. Sometimes it is the only thing that makes you truly see. Eleanor and I built Whitmore Development from absolutely nothing. People hear that phrase and they nod politely, but they don't understand what nothing actually means. In 1983, we had $400, a rusted-out pickup with a cracked windshield that let the rain in, and a single lot on the edge of town that nobody else wanted because it flooded twice a year. I dug the drainage on that lot by hand in the rain with a shovel I bought secondhand, while Eleanor held an umbrella over the blueprints so they wouldn't turn to mush. She kept the books at our kitchen table with a pencil and a shoebox full of receipts, and she was better with $1 than any banker I ever met. We built one small house on that ugly lot with our own hands and a crew of 2 men who worked for the promise of pay, and we sold it, and we rolled every last dollar of the profit into 2 more lots. We ate a lot of cold beans those years. I am not being poetic. Cold beans, out of the can, standing up in a half-framed house because we couldn't afford to stop working long enough to sit. We patched the same coat through 3 winters. One December, our furnace died, and we couldn't fix it and make payroll both, so we chose payroll, and we slept under every blanket we owned with our breath fogging in the bedroom, and Eleanor laughed about it, actually laughed, and said we were rich in a way money couldn't touch. There was a night, our first big contract, a whole street of houses. When we sat on overturned buckets in a finished kitchen, we'd built and drank cheap champagne out of paper cups, And Eleanor cried, and I asked her why, and she said, "Because we did it, Harold. We really did it. Nobody handed us a thing, and we did it anyway." 40 years later, I can still hear her say it, but brick by brick, deed by deed, lot by lot, we built something real, and we built it clean, and we built it together. 40 years later, Whitmore Development Group was worth close to $18 million. We owned commercial buildings downtown. We had a construction arm that employed over 100 good men and women, and at the center of all of it sat the estate on Linden Hill, the big stone house I built for Eleanor the year our son was born, the house where that Sunday dinner had just taken place. Here is the thing my son and his wife never bothered to learn, because learning it would have required them to actually respect me. Every deed, every title, every share of that company was still held in my name. Not in a trust they could raid, not in Daniel's name, in mine, alone. The house they slept in, the offices downtown, the construction yard, the commercial buildings. Every last square foot of it, in the eyes of the law, was Harold Whitmore's and no one else's. Eleanor and I had structured it that way on purpose, decades ago, sitting across the desk from our accountant Marcus Feldman. We did it because we had both watched it happen to other families. We watched Eleanor's own brother charm and manipulate her parents into signing their farm into a trust for tax reasons. And then, the moment the ink was dry, we watched him push those two old people out of the only home they had ever known. Eleanor swore on her mother's grave that it would never happen to us, and she made me swear it too. "Hold the reins yourself, Harold," she used to say, tapping the table with one finger, the way she did when she meant business. "Be generous. Give the children everything they need. Pay for the schools, buy them the cars, set them up nice. But you keep the deed. You keep the shares. You keep the one thing they could ever use to put you in the cold. The day you sign that away is the day you find out what your kindness was really worth to them." She was a wise woman. She was wiser than all of us put together. And though she had been in the ground for a year, she was about to reach out from beyond the grave and save my life from the very people she had warned me about. Every safeguard she insisted on, every clause she made me promise to keep, every stubborn refusal to make things simpler for the children, was a wall she had built around me before she died. I just hadn't understood, until that Sunday, that she'd been building me a fortress. The trouble started about 3 weeks before that Sunday dinner. Though I did not understand it as trouble at the time, I understood it as a folder. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a single coffee cup, when I heard the sharp click of Vanessa's heels on the hardwood. She came in without knocking, the way she always did, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit that looked more like armor than clothing. There was no grief on her face. There was no warmth. She dropped a thick folder on the counter beside me. Across the top page, in bold black letters, I read the words, "Family Asset Consolidation and Care Agreement." I dried my hands and turned to face her. "What's this, Vanessa?" She sighed, that long theatrical sigh she used whenever she wanted me to feel like a burden. "It's for your own good, Harold. You're not well. You lost Eleanor. You're not sleeping. Your blood pressure is through the roof. You have no business running a company anymore. This agreement moves the house and the business into a family trust that Daniel and I will manage. You keep a room. You keep an allowance. And you finally get to rest." I looked down at the folder. I did not open it. I already knew, in the way you know a bad smell before you find its source, that whatever was inside would not be good for me. "The company is doing just fine," I said calmly. "I'm grieving, Vanessa. I'm not incapable." Right on cue, as if he'd been waiting in the hall for his line, my son Daniel came in. He put a soft hand on my shoulder and gave me the tender, worried look he had clearly practiced in a mirror. He was wearing a watch I bought him and standing in a kitchen I paid for. "Dad, please just listen to her," he said gently. "We're worried about you. We don't want to lose you too. Just let us take the weight off your shoulders. Sign the agreement, let us handle the day-to-day, and you can rest. You've earned it. You don't have to carry any of it anymore." It sounded so loving. It was the perfect, plausible lie. A devoted son and a caring daughter-in-law stepping forward to shoulder an old man's burdens. But I had raised Daniel. I had watched him grow from a bright, curious boy into a soft, hollow man who could not order lunch without checking his wife's face first. I had paid for a very expensive education that produced a person with no spine at all. I looked at the gold pen Vanessa had conveniently placed on top of the folder. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, stepping back. I want to read every line before I sign anything. That's just good business. You both taught me that yourselves. Daniel nodded eagerly, relieved I hadn't refused outright. Of course, Dad. Take your time. Just don't take too long. The market's uncertain. The company needs steady leadership. They left together, their footsteps fading down the hall. I stood alone at the sink and looked at my own reflection in the dark kitchen window. And in that reflection, I saw Vanessa pause by the front door. She pulled out her phone and typed quickly, a small, sharp smile curling at the edge of her mouth. She had no idea I could see her clearly in the glass. As her thumb pressed send, she murmured to herself, barely above a breath. He'll fold. They always fold once they're alone. I stood in my quiet kitchen, with the water still dripping from the faucet, and something very old and very cold woke up inside my chest. They thought I was a broken man who had forgotten how to fight. They were about to be reminded. You can repaint a house any color you like. It does not change one single letter of whose name is on the deed. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I hadn't slept much. The silence of the house pressed on me, and the knowledge that my own family was circling me like buzzards made the air feel thin. I needed to stand somewhere that reminded me of who I was before I became the poor old widower in my children's eyes. So I got in my truck and drove to Whitmore Development offices downtown, the same way I had driven there nearly every morning for 30 years. I parked in my reserved spot, nodded to the security guard, and walked to the main entrance with my key card in hand. I swiped it against the reader. The little light blinked red. Access denied. I frowned and swiped again. Red again. I stood there in the gray morning light, staring at a lock in my own building that would not open for me. Trouble with the door, Harold? The voice came from the shadow of the parking garage entrance. I turned. Stepping out into the light, in a suit far too expensive for a man his age, was Preston Vale, our chief financial officer. Preston was 46, always tanned, always smelling of some sharp cologne that arrived in a room before he did. He had been with the company 6 years, and I had never once fully trusted him, though I could never have told you exactly why. He walked toward me with a smile that showed a great many teeth. "Preston," I said evenly, "my card seems to be malfunctioning." "Oh, right." His smile widened just a fraction. "We ran a full security upgrade over the weekend. Daniel authorized it. New access protocols, rekeyed the whole building. Since you've been taking time to grieve, he figured he'd handle it. Your card just hasn't been reprovisioned yet. I'll put in a request. Might take a few days." He tucked his hands in his pockets. "You really should be resting, Harold. Let us worry about the building." Daniel authorized it. I turned the words over slowly. My son had ordered me locked out of the company I built, and hadn't so much as mentioned it to my face. The old Harold, the young man who once chased a lumber thief 4 blocks on foot and dragged him back to the yard by his collar, wanted very badly to grab Preston Vale by his silk tie and walk him straight through the glass doors. I could feel that younger man straining against the harness of my age. But the man actually standing there in the gray dawn was 72 years old and had survived 4 recessions, 2 lawsuits, and 100 hostile negotiations. And he knew a truth the young man had never learned. The moment you show your temper, you have already lost the room. If I made a scene in that parking garage, in front of the security camera bolted to the concrete pillar behind Preston's head, I would prove their whole story. I would hand Vanessa the exact footage she needed, the unstable old man, the erratic widower, the one who had to be managed for his own good. So, I did the hardest thing a proud man can do. I smiled, and I made myself sound grateful. A security upgrade. Long overdue, I'm sure. You can't be too careful these days. I even nodded, as if he'd done me a favor. Tell Daniel I appreciate his initiative. It's good to see him taking things seriously. Something flickered behind Preston's eyes, a flash of surprise. He had braced for anger. He'd wanted anger. Anger he could use. My calm unsettled him, and I filed that reaction away. The way I've filed away 1,000 reactions across 1,000 deals. I turned and walked back to my truck at an easy, unhurried pace, my hands loose at my sides, and I did not look back once. I could feel his smug gaze burning into my spine the whole way across the lot, but I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me hurry or hesitate or glance over my shoulder like a beaten dog. I sat in the cab of my truck, put both hands on the cold wheel, and breathed slowly. in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way I'd learned to do before walking into a negotiation I intended to win. They thought that shutting off my keycard had made me blind. They thought that because they held the modern locks and the modern servers, they held the truth. They fundamentally misunderstood how an old builder guards his house, because I did not need their front door. 40 years of building things had taught me one thing above all others. Always leave yourself a second way in. When we digitized the company records a decade ago, I had a quiet arrangement made. A full mirror of every financial record, every deed, every transaction, backed up nightly to an encrypted drive that lived in a locked box under the floorboards of my home office. Marcus Feldman was the only other soul on earth who knew it existed. I did not need Preston Vale to let me into my own history. I already had all of it, safe at home. I drove home, turning it all over in my mind. And I had just pulled into my driveway when my phone rang. The screen read, Cornerstone Federal Bank. I answered. A pleasant young woman's voice came on the line. Good morning. Is this Mr. Harold Whitmore? Speaking. Wonderful. Mr. Whitmore, I'm calling from the mortgage department at Cornerstone Federal. We just need to verify a few details before we can finalize the cash-out refinance on the Linden Hill property. I have the application here requesting $1.2 million against the home's equity. Can you confirm the loan is for property improvements, as stated? The world went very quiet. I sat in my truck in my own driveway, staring at the stone house I built for my wife with my own two hands, and the blood in my veins turned to cold water. I had not applied for any loan. I had not spoken to any bank. I had not authorized a single living soul to borrow $1 against that house. That house had been paid off, free and clear, for 22 years. I had burned the mortgage papers in the backyard fire pit the night we made the final payment, and Eleanor and I had danced on the patio to the radio while the ashes floated up into the dark. And now somebody had walked into a bank, sat down at a desk, filled out an application with my name printed across the top, and tried to pull $1.2 million out of the home my wife had died in, the home her ashes were scattered under the rose bushes of. They had reached into the grave and put their hands on the last thing I had left of her, and they had tried to sell it out from under me while I grieved. For one long moment, sitting in that truck, I felt something I had not felt in years. Pure, white-hot rage. It rose up from somewhere deep and old, and it wanted very badly to burn the whole world down. I let it come. I did not fight it. I sat there, and I let it burn through me completely, all the way to the bottom, because I have learned that rage you refuse to feel comes out sideways and makes you stupid, and rage you let pass through you clean leaves behind something far more dangerous. It leaves behind clarity. And by the time that pleasant young woman on the phone finished her sentence, the fire had burned down to a cold, steady, unblinking flame, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I kept my voice absolutely level. Decades of negotiation had taught me that too. I'm so glad you called to verify, I said warmly. I want to be very careful about this. Would you do me a favor and read me back exactly what's on that application? The signature date, the contact information listed, all of it. I want to make sure the paperwork is clean. She was happy to help. She read it all out, and with every line she read, the picture sharpened into something monstrous. The application listed a phone number that was not mine. It listed an email address I had never seen. And the authorizing signature was dated 11 days ago, on an afternoon when I had been sitting at Eleanor's grave with a thermos of coffee, talking to a headstone. Somebody had forged my signature. Thank you, I told the young woman, my voice never wavering. I think I'd like to come in and review this in person before we go any further. Please put a hold on all activity on that application. No disbursements, nothing, until I sit down with a manager. Can you flag it for me? She flagged it. She had no idea she had just helped an old man catch a thief. I thanked her, hung up, and sat perfectly still for a long moment as the pieces began sliding into place with a terrible, clicking clarity. They weren't just trying to get me to sign a folder. They were already stealing, and the loan application meant they were getting desperate and sloppy and fast. I went inside, locked the door to my home office, closed the blinds, and pried up the floorboard. The encrypted drive was exactly where it had been for 10 years, sleeping in its steel box. I plugged it into my laptop, entered the long passwords only I knew, and for the first time in far too long, I sat down to look, really look, at the guts of the company I had spent my life building. What I found made me physically sick. I sat in the pool of lamplight, with the world dark and silent outside the blinds, and I went hunting through my own company's veins for the disease. I started with the construction division's vendor accounts, because that is where a smart thief always hides, down in the endless boring river of invoices that nobody with any sense ever reads all the way through. A thief counts on your boredom the way a pickpocket counts on a crowd. And there, buried in the flow of legitimate lumber orders and concrete deliveries and equipment rentals over the past 10 months, I found them. 4 vendors I had never heard of in 40 years of running this business, all of them registered within the same 2-week window last spring. Pinnacle Site Services, Meridian Materials Group, Keystone Grading LLC, Ironwood Consulting Partners. Generic, forgettable, corporate-sounding names, the kind that slide right past a tired bookkeeper's eyes at the end of a long day, the kind you'd never look at twice. I pulled the invoices attached to each one, and my stomach began to turn. Grading work billed for sites that never needed grading, consulting fees for consulting that never happened, for projects that never existed, material deliveries logged from materials that were never delivered, to job sites that had closed months before. Every single invoice was carefully, deliberately sized, always coming in just below the dollar amount that would have triggered a second signature or kicked the payment up for review. Whoever built this understood the exact architecture of my company's internal controls, the way a burglar understands the blind spots of a house he has cased for a year. This was not sloppy. This was surgical. Somebody who knew precisely where every tripwire was buried had built a quiet little machine to bleed Whitmore development dry, one small, invisible, forgettable cut at a time. And I did not have to wonder for long who in my company understood those controls better than anyone alive except me, the Chief Financial Officer, Preston Vale. I cross-referenced the payments against our master accounts, and when the numbers finally lined up on my screen, I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from being sick. The money flowing out to those 4 fake vendors had drained $1.1 million from the company over 10 months. And it wasn't coming out of profit. It was coming out of the employee retirement fund, the money set aside for the truck drivers and the framers and the crane operators who had given their whole working lives to Whitmore Development. My people. They were stealing from my people. Then I looked at the dates, and the last of my composure cracked clean down the middle. The first withdrawal, the very first fraudulent payment out of that fund, was dated 10 months ago, almost to the day. I sat there, and I stared at that date, and I felt the floor of my stomach fall away because I knew that date. I would know that date until the day I died. That was the same week Eleanor got her diagnosis. That was the week the doctor sat us down in a beige little room with a box of tissues on the table and used the word aggressive. And Eleanor reached over and held my hand under the table so I wouldn't fall apart in front of him. That was the week I stopped coming into the office and started spending my days in oncology waiting rooms, memorizing the pattern of the ceiling tiles, holding my wife's thin hand while a machine dripped poison into her veins in the desperate hope it might buy us 6 more months. It bought us 3. And while I sat in those waiting rooms, while I learned the sound of my wife's failing breath so I could carry it with me for the rest of my life, my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer had chosen that exact week to open the vault and start carrying it out. They had watched Eleanor get sick, and they had not seen a dying woman or a grieving family or a tragedy. They had seen an opportunity. They had looked at my pain and calculated that it would make me blind, and they had built their whole scheme around the timing of my wife's death. They scheduled their theft to my grief. I sat back in the dark and let the full, sickening weight of it settle onto me. Every single time Vanessa had shown up at the hospice with a carefully arranged sad face and a bunch of wilting grocery store flowers, every time she had squeezed my shoulder and murmured that she was there for me, she had been standing in that room running the numbers behind her eyes, calculating how much more she could pull out of the vault before anyone thought to look. She had used the last weeks of my wife's life as cover. Some cruelties are too large to feel all at once. You have to take them in slowly, a piece at a time, or they'll stop your heart. But I still didn't understand the whole shape of it. The embezzlement was a crime, an ugly, unforgivable crime, but it wasn't the whole plan. I opened that folder again, the Family Asset Consolidation and Care Agreement, and this time I read every word, all the way to the dense legal clauses buried at the very back. And there it was, hidden under 3 paragraphs of soft language about care and family harmony. An indemnification clause. If I signed that agreement, I would be legally releasing the new managers, Daniel and Vanessa, from any and all financial liability for the period before the transfer. And a second clause authorized the upcoming year-end tax filing and audit under my signature as the sole responsible party. The folder was never about power, the forged loan, the fake vendors. All of it was building toward one thing. Our year-end audit was 6 weeks away. An outside firm would open the books, and it would take them about an hour to find a gaping hole in the retirement fund. When the questions came, when the authorities eventually came, they would look at the signatures. They would see the forged loan application. They would see the indemnification clause. And they would see my name on every last piece of it. They weren't just robbing me. They were building a gallows and trying to get me to tie my own noose. If I signed that folder, I would be legally certifying every crime they had committed, taking the full weight of it onto my own back, so they could walk away clean and rich while an old man went to prison for stealing from his own employees. They needed my signature to bury me, and they were willing to use Eleanor's death to get it. They had badly underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. I did not act right away. That is the mistake the young and the angry always make, the mistake Vanessa was counting on. When you corner a man and he lashes out, he shows you his whole hand, and you learn how to beat him. I had spent 40 years across the table from men trying to hide the truth, and I knew that the strongest move, the deadliest move, was patience. So I did the hardest thing there is. I did nothing that they could see. I let them believe they were winning, but underneath that stillness, I went to work. The first thing I did was call the only 2 men on earth I still trusted completely. The first was Marcus Feldman, my accountant of 35 years, the man who had helped Eleanor and me structure everything we owned. I told him what I'd found. There was a long silence on the line, and then Marcus, who almost never cursed, said one very short word, and then said, "Harold, whatever you need, I'll clear my calendar. We'll take these people apart with a calculator." That is exactly the man you want beside you in a war like this. Not a screamer. A man who can read a ledger like a hunter reads tracks in the snow. The second call was to David Kessler, an attorney I had used for years to crush people who tried to crush me. David was 58, cold, brilliant, and utterly without mercy once you pointed him at a target. I told him everything. He did not gasp or offer sympathy. He asked 3 sharp questions about the deeds, the corporate structure, and the timeline. And when I answered them, he went very quiet, and then he said, "Harold, do you understand what you're holding? They've committed forgery, they've committed embezzlement, and they've done it while every deed and every share is still legally yours. You don't just have a defense, you have a cannon. Don't fire it yet. Let me load it properly." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. And then I did the third thing, the thing that would turn a financial crime into the full, ugly truth. I hired a man named Frank Delgado. Frank was a retired detective who had spent 22 years working financial crimes before hanging out his own shingle as a private investigator. He worked out of a plain little office above a dry cleaner on the east side of town, and he had the kind of tired, patient eyes that had seen every rotten thing people do to each other for money. I sat across his metal desk, took out my checkbook, signed a check, and slid it to him with the amount left blank. "I need you to turn my daughter-in-law's life inside out," I said. "Vanessa Whitmore. Before she married my son, and every day since. Where she goes, who she meets, where the money goes, leave nothing standing." Frank picked up the blank check and studied it, then studied me. "Where do you want me to start, Mr. Whitmore?" I thought about the tanned face and that sharp cologne in the parking garage. "Start with Preston Vale," I said, "my chief financial officer. I want to know exactly how those 2 know each other." Frank gave a slow nod, and something in his tired eyes sharpened. "Give me a week." While Frank did his work, I decided to run a small, quiet test of my own. I needed to know how deep my son was in this. There is a difference in my mind and in the law between a weak man who lets his wife walk him into ruin and a willing man who signs his name to a crime. I had to know which one Daniel was before I decided what to do with him. So I called him and asked if he'd have lunch with his old man, just the 2 of us. I let my voice sound tired and sad, and he agreed, and I could hear the wary relief in it, the sound of a man who thinks his father is finally coming around to the plan. We met at a quiet diner near the office, a booth in the back, 2 cups of coffee between us. I let the silence sit for a while. I looked at my son, at the soft face and the expensive watch and the eyes that couldn't quite hold mine, and I felt the old ache of loving somebody you no longer respect. "Daniel," I said gently, wrapping both hands around my mug, "I've been going over some of the old accounts, just to keep my mind busy, you understand. And I noticed a few vendors I didn't recognize. Pinnacle, Meridian, a couple of others. I couldn't place the work they'd done. I figured you'd know, since you've been running things. What are those?" I watched him the way I've watched 100 men across 100 tables. And my son did not react the way an innocent man reacts. An innocent man frowns, thinks, says he'll look into it, shrugs it off as some subcontractor he'd forgotten. Daniel went pale. A fine sweat broke out along his hairline. His hand tightened around his cup until his knuckles went white, and his eyes darted to the window, to the door, anywhere but my face. "Those are just... Preston handles the vendors," he said too fast, his voice climbing half an octave. "That's his department. I don't get into the weeds on that stuff, Dad. Why are you digging through the accounts? You're supposed to be resting. This is exactly what Vanessa's worried about. You sitting alone in that house, obsessing over spreadsheets. It's not healthy." He wasn't answering my question. He was attacking the question. He was using my grief as a shield, turning my curiosity into a symptom. A man with nothing to hide gets curious right along with you. A guilty man tries to make you feel crazy for asking. I had my answer, and it broke something in me, even as it hardened something else. "You're probably right," I said softly, and I let him see the tired old man he wanted to see. "I should leave the numbers to you young people. My eyes aren't what they were." The relief that flooded his face was almost unbearable to watch. He thought he'd deflected me. He thought the old man had wandered up to the edge of the truth and then shuffled harmlessly away. He reached over and patted my hand and told me not to worry about a thing, and I let him. And inside, I said goodbye to the last small piece of hope I'd been carrying, that my son might be innocent. He was not innocent. He knew. And now so did I. While Frank hunted, Marcus and I turned my home office into a quiet war room. Night after night, we walked backward through 10 months of theft, tracing every fraudulent invoice to its shell company, every shell company to its bank account, every bank account to the offshore routing numbers where the money finally vanished. It was slow, brutal, tedious work. The kind of work thieves count on nobody having the patience to do. But Marcus had built his whole life on patience, and I had built mine, and we did not stop. Bit by bit, we assembled a paper trail so complete, so undeniable, that no jury on earth would need more than an afternoon to understand it. And through it all, I kept up the performance. When Daniel called, anxious about the folder, I answered in a tired, defeated voice, and told him I just needed a little more time, that the grief was heavy, that I understood their concern. When Vanessa texted with her fake sweetness, I sent back a weary, agreeable reply. Every word was a brick in the wall I was building around them, and they never once saw it going up. They thought they were watching a broken man surrender. They were watching a carpenter measure them for a box. 6 days later, Frank Delgado called and gave me an address for a diner out by the interstate, and a time. I got there early. It was one of those all-night places that smells of old grease and burnt coffee, with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who had long since stopped pretending to care. Frank was already tucked into the back corner, a mug of black coffee in front of him, and a thick manila folder on the table. As I slid in across from him, he didn't waste a word. He just pushed the folder across the scarred tabletop until it touched my hands. "You were right to start with Vale," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They weren't careful. Arrogant people never are." I opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, date stamped 9 days earlier. Vanessa and Preston at a candlelit table in a restaurant 2 towns over. His hand resting over hers, their faces close in the unmistakable posture of 2 people who have known each other's bodies for a very long time. It was not a business dinner. "They didn't meet at your company," Frank said, tapping a stack of records at the back of the folder. "They met 21 years ago at a state business college. They dated for 3 years, lived together. When they figured out neither of them came from money, they seemed to have made a plan. She'd marry up. He'd get himself hired somewhere useful, and they'd take the long way to the same pile of money." He looked at me steadily. "She started seeing your son 8 months after she and Vale broke up on paper. On paper, Mr. Whitmore. because they never actually stopped. 19 years, on and off, hotel receipts, flights, a storage unit in her maiden name. The whole time she was married to your boy, she was still with Vale. I turned the pages slowly, watching 19 years of betrayal assemble itself in front of me in receipts and photographs. My daughter-in-law had married my son as a business acquisition. My CFO had gotten himself hired into my company as an inside man. And together, they had spent nearly 2 decades slowly working their way toward the moment when they could strip everything Eleanor and I had ever built and disappear. "There's more," Frank said, and his voice dropped lower, the way a man's voice drops when he has to hand you something that's going to hurt. He pulled a single sheet from the very back, clipped to a bank statement. This was the hard part to pull. It's out of a personal account Vale set up in the Caymans. The money from those 4 fake vendors, the stuff drained out of your retirement fund, it's not going into a joint pot with your son. It's going here, to an account only Vale and your daughter-in-law can touch. I stared at the statement. "Daniel's not on it." "Daniel's not on anything," Frank said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm sorry to be the one. Based on the paper, based on the pattern, your daughter-in-law was never planning to share this with your son at all. The care agreement moves everything into a trust she controls. The stolen money goes to an account your son can't see. There's a divorce attorney she's consulted twice in the last 4 months, quietly, under her maiden name. Your daughter-in-law's plan was to get you to sign, strip the company, and then divorce Daniel and vanish with Vale. She wasn't just going to put you out on the street. She was going to do it to your son, too. He just doesn't know it yet." I sat in that sticky booth as the diner faded around me. And here is the strange thing. My first feeling was not rage. My first feeling, God help me, was a flicker of grief for Daniel, because for all his cowardice, for all his weakness, he was still my boy, and he had married a woman who was going to gut him like a fish the moment he'd served his purpose. But then Frank slid one more page across the table, and the grief burned away. It was an email, printed out, recovered from a deleted archive, dated 4 months ago. It was from Daniel's private account to Vanessa's. I read it, and what little was left of the son I thought I knew died right there on that laminate table. "Vanessa," the email read, "I signed the vendor authorizations like you asked. I don't want to know the details. I trust you. But I need you to promise me my father never finds out I signed anything. If he sees my name on any of it, he'll cut me out of the trust for good, and then we get nothing. Mom set up the bloodline clause so tight there's no way around it if he decides to fight. As long as he thinks I'm just the worried son, we're fine. Keep me clean. Keep me out of it. I don't want to see the paperwork. I just want it done." Daniel knew. He hadn't known about the affair, and he hadn't known Vanessa was planning to betray him too. But he knew about the theft. My son had personally signed the vendor authorizations that funneled money out of his own father's employee's retirement fund. He had done it deliberately, with his eyes open, and then he had begged his wife to keep his fingerprints off it so that I would never know. He wasn't an innocent bystander. He wasn't a victim of Vanessa's scheme. He was a willing thief who was too cowardly even to look at what he was stealing. Eleanor had built a clause into everything we owned decades ago. She called it her bloodline clause. It said, in ironclad language, that our assets could only ever pass to direct heirs who had earned them honestly, and that any heir who moved against the family or against the honest running of the business forfeited every claim. She had insisted on it because she had watched her own brother destroy her parents' farm out of pure greed, and she had sworn our children would never do the same to us. Daniel knew about that clause. He knew that the moment I discovered his hand in the theft, he was finished. And so, terrified of losing his comfortable, borrowed life, he had sold his own father, sold his dead mother's honor, and thrown in with the very people who were planning to destroy him. I folded the email in half, very carefully, and slid it back into the folder. The sorrow was gone. In its place was something cold and clear and absolutely certain. "Thank you, Frank," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, calm and quiet and far away. "This is exactly what I needed." Frank studied my face for a moment, and something in his tired eyes shifted into respect. "What's your next move, Mr. Whitmore?" I buttoned my coat and stood. "I'm going to go home," I said, "and I'm going to invite my son and his loving wife to Sunday dinner, and I'm going to be the broken old man they want me to be, one last time. I'm going to hand them enough rope to hang themselves in front of the whole family." And then I'm going to kick the chair out from under them. I drove home through the dark with the folder on the seat beside me, and I did not feel my age. For the first time in a year, I felt like myself again. I spent the next several days moving through my life like a ghost, playing my part to perfection. But behind the mask, Marcus and David and I were building the machine that would end them. Marcus finalized the forensic accounting into a bound report so clean and so damning that it read like a confession. Every dollar, every date, every shell company, every routing number, traced from my employee's retirement fund into a Cayman account with Vanessa's and Preston's names on it, and Daniel's signature on the authorizations that started it all. David Kessler drew up the legal instruments. Because here was the beautiful, brutal truth at the center of everything. The truth Vanessa and Daniel had been too arrogant to check. They had spent months maneuvering to make me sign the house and the company over to them. But they had never once verified whether I needed to. Every deed to every property, including the Linden Hill estate they were living in, was in my name alone. Every share of Whitmore Development Group was mine. The company Daniel ran, he ran entirely at my pleasure as an employee. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing. He had a title I had given him and a paycheck I signed. They had been threatening to take from me things that were already completely legally mine, and to which they had no claim at all. David didn't need to win me anything. He just needed to help me stop pretending I'd lost it. And David made a fourth call to a woman named Agent Harmon at the Criminal Investigation Division. Embezzlement of an employee retirement fund, wire fraud, forgery on a federally regulated bank loan, funds moved offshore. These are not family squabbles. These are federal crimes. Harmon and her team spent 2 full days walking the digital trail Marcus and I had laid out for them, verifying every step, and by the end of it, they had what they needed: warrants, a plan, and a quiet interest in being present when the truth came out. While we built our machine, Vanessa and Preston, certain they had already won, threw away the last of their caution. They stopped hiding. That week, Preston fired Ray Coleman, my construction superintendent of 20 years, the best builder I ever hired, a man who had carried this company on his back through 2 recessions. He handed Ray a severance envelope and a security escort, and put one of his own soft-handed cronies in Ray's chair. He fired my office manager and my lead estimator the same week. Daniel signed every termination without reading it, hiding in his corner office while his wife's lover gutted the company of everyone who might notice the theft. Ray called me, furious and confused, and I told him to take the severance, take his wife somewhere warm for a week, and keep his phone on. I promised him, in a voice that left no room for doubt, that he would be back in his chair by month's end. He trusted me. He'd earned the right to. And Vanessa, drunk on her imagined victory, could not even wait. I stopped by the office one afternoon, in my role as the sad departing founder, and found 2 decorators in my old office with measuring tapes, and Vanessa in the center of the room, pointing at Eleanor's oak desk, the desk where my wife had kept the books for 30 years, telling them to haul it out and put in something Italian and white. She saw me in the doorway and gave me a small, patronizing smile, and told me not to worry. They'd have my personal things boxed up for me by Friday. I thanked her for her consideration and walked away. I did not feel anger. I felt a cold, quiet anticipation, like a man watching a storm he knows is coming roll in over a field. Then, when everything was in place, I set the hook. I called Daniel one evening, and I let my voice be everything they wanted it to be: tired, small, defeated. I let it crack in the right places. I told him he'd been right, that they'd all been right, that I couldn't do it anymore. I told him the house was just a tomb without his mother, that the company was too heavy, that I was so tired, so very tired, and I just wanted to rest. I told him I had made my decision. I wanted to sign. I could hear the breath he sucked in, the sound of a man who thinks he's won. I told him I wanted to do it properly, the right way, as a family. I asked them all to come stay the whole weekend at the estate, the way we used to when Eleanor was alive and the house was full. I said I wanted one last real family weekend before I handed things over, that I wanted to cook and sit by the fire and pass the torch on Sunday with everyone under one roof. I said I wanted Sophie there. I even asked them to bring the final documents so we could take care of the signing Monday morning before they all headed home. Daniel's relief poured down the line like water. Vanessa's greed practically hummed through the speaker when he put me on with her. "Oh, Harold, of course. What a lovely idea. We'll bring everything. We'll make it a real family weekend." She said they'd bring Preston by on Sunday too, since he'd need to be part of the transition. Of course he would. I said that sounded perfect. I said I couldn't wait to have the whole family together again. And so they came, and they stayed, and they slept in the guest rooms of the house they were plotting to steal. And on Sunday evening, we all sat down to dinner in Eleanor's dining room. That is where the ambitious ones always make their fatal mistake. They cannot resist the taste of the victory. Vanessa could not wait until Monday's polite little signing. Sitting at my wife's place at my wife's table, with the whole family gathered and the old man looking beaten, she decided to enjoy her win a night early. She set the folder beside my plate, rose to her feet, and told me to sign everything over or find somewhere else to live. And that brings us all the way back to that silent dining room, and the folder beside my plate, and my son studying his fork, and the whole family waiting for the old man to crumble. I had let her say it. I had let the whole table hear it. I had let my son stare at his fork while his wife threatened to throw his father into the street. I had smiled and thanked her for the meal and gone up to bed, because I wanted them to have one last night believing they had won. I wanted them to sleep well. It would be the last good sleep either of them would have for 15 years. The next morning came gray and cold and clear, the kind of morning Eleanor used to love. I got up before any of them, showered, and put on a good shirt, not the rumpled cardigan of the broken widower, but a pressed collar and a clean face. The performance was over. Then I went down to the kitchen and made a full pot of coffee, and I called them all down, warm and pleasant, saying I wanted to take care of everything before they had to drive home. They came down still half in their victory, entirely certain of it. Daniel, nervous but relieved. Vanessa, already dressed sharp, already living in the future. Preston had arrived early, invited by Vanessa to oversee the transition, and he strolled in with that same tanned confidence and that same cologne arriving before him. Sophie. I had quietly sent to a friend's house the night before, on a small kind lie about a school project, because a girl should not have to watch what was about to happen to her parents. I poured them all coffee with my own hands and set the cups down in front of them. And then I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus Feldman, and I put him on speaker, right there in the middle of the table, in front of all three of them. They thought I was calling to summon the lawyer for the signing. Vanessa had the folder open in front of her, the gold pen resting on top of it, that cold little smile back on her face, sipping her coffee like a queen surveying a kingdom she'd already conquered. "Marcus," I said pleasantly, "I've got the family here with me this morning. There's been a lot of talk about signing the house and the company over, and I want everyone to have their facts straight before we go any further. So, do me a favor. I want you to pull the official ownership records for the Linden Hill estate and for Whitmore Development Group, and I want you to read them out loud, right now, so everyone at this table can hear exactly how things stand." There was a pause, and then Marcus's dry, steady voice came through the speaker. "Happy to, Harold. Linden Hill Estate, deed recorded at the county registry. Sole owner of record, Harold Whitmore. No liens, no co-owners, no trust. The pending refinance application against the property was flagged and frozen last week as suspected fraud. The signature on it has been referred for handwriting analysis." He turned a page. I could hear it. "Whitmore Development Group, 100% of shares held by Harold Whitmore. Daniel Whitmore's status in the company. Salaried employee, title of general manager, no equity, no signing authority over corporate assets, appointment revocable at the owner's discretion. Vanessa Whitmore, no role, no shares, no authority of any kind. Preston Vale. Chief Financial Officer, salaried employee, terminated as of 8 o'clock this morning." A last page turned. "In short, Harold, everything they've been asking you to sign over to them already belongs entirely to you. There is nothing for you to sign. If anything, the question is who at that table still needs your signature to keep the roof over their head." The silence in Eleanor's dining room was absolute. Even the refrigerator seemed to hold its breath. I watched their faces the way a man watches a wall he has just tapped a crack into, waiting for the collapse. Vanessa's smile had frozen the moment Marcus said, "sole owner of record," and by the time he reached the frozen loan application, it had cracked right down the middle, and by the words, "there is nothing for you to sign," it had shattered off her face entirely, leaving behind something raw and small and afraid. The gold pen slipped out of her fingers and rolled across the linen and off the edge of the table and clattered onto the floor, and none of them moved to pick it up. Daniel had gone the color of old paper. He was staring at the phone in the center of the table as if it were a snake. He understood, at least, that the ground had opened beneath him, even if he didn't yet know how far the fall went. Preston Vale was the one who reacted fastest, because Preston was the one who understood money, and a man who understands money understands exactly what "terminated as of 8 o'clock this morning" means when it is read out loud by the owner's accountant. It means the owner already knows. It means it is already too late. I watched the calculation race across his face, and I watched him decide to run. He pushed his chair back and started to rise, his eyes going to the hallway, to the door, to his office across town, where the last of the digital evidence still sat waiting to be scrubbed. "Marcus, thank you," I said calmly into the phone, still watching Preston. "That was very clear. I think everyone understands the situation now." "My pleasure, Harold," said Marcus's dry voice. "Give my best to your guests." I hung up. That was when the doorbell rang. I set my coffee down, unhurried, and went to answer it myself. I did not rush. I had waited a year for this morning, and I intended to walk to it, not run. I opened my own front door, and there on the porch stood David Kessler, briefcase in hand, in a suit as sharp as a blade, and behind him, two calm, unsmiling people in dark jackets with a stillness to them that told you exactly what they were before you saw the badges, with Agent Harmon at the front. I stepped aside and let them in, and the temperature in that house seemed to drop 10 degrees as they came through the door. Preston Vale, halfway to his feet, saw them and sat back down very slowly. David walked straight into the dining room and set his briefcase on the sideboard, right next to the framed photograph of Eleanor that had watched over every family dinner in that house for 30 years. He did not sit. He did not offer a greeting. He unclasped the briefcase, the twin snaps loud as gunshots in the dead silence, and he looked at the three people at the table one by one, and then he began, in a voice as flat and level and merciless as a plumb line. "I represent Harold Whitmore in all matters concerning his estate and Whitmore Development Group," he said, his voice flat and precise as a level. "I'll be brief because the facts are simple." He opened the briefcase and laid out a bound report. "This is a complete forensic accounting of $1.1 million embezzled from the Whitmore Development Employee Retirement Fund over the past 10 months, funneled through 4 fraudulent vendor companies into an offshore account held jointly by Vanessa Whitmore and Preston Vale." He laid down a second document. "This is a bank fraud referral concerning a forged loan application against the Linden Hill estate, submitted using Mr. Whitmore's identity without his knowledge or consent." He laid down a third. "And this is an email, dated 4 months ago, in which Daniel Whitmore acknowledges personally signing the vendor authorizations that made the theft possible, and requests that the theft be concealed from his own father." He looked up. "The family asset consolidation and care agreement you brought to this house is void. It transfers nothing, because the parties presenting it own nothing to consolidate and had no authority to draft it. There is no signature Mr. Whitmore is required to provide. The only remaining question is one for these agents." Agent Harmon stepped forward. Preston bolted. He came up out of that chair and got 2 steps toward the hall before the larger of the 2 agents crossed the room with an unhurried, terrible efficiency and put one broad hand flat on his chest and walked him backward into the wall, pinning Eleanor's good china rattling in the cabinet beside him. "Don't," the agent said almost gently. "Sit down, Mr. Vale. Preston Vale, Vanessa Whitmore." Harmon's voice was quiet and certain, the voice of someone who has done this 1,000 times and finds no drama in it at all. "You're under arrest for wire fraud and for the embezzlement of funds from a protected employee retirement plan. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The handcuffs came out, bright steel catching the morning light, and the sound they made ratcheting shut cut through the dining room like a blade. And then the thing I had known would happen, the thing I had counted on, happened. The alliance they had built and hidden intended for 19 years shattered in about 19 seconds. There is no loyalty among thieves. There is only the arithmetic of who goes down hardest. Vanessa came up out of her chair, her composure gone, her styled hair falling loose around a face I had never truly seen before, twisted and hysterical. You said it was covered, she screamed at Preston. You swore to me the routing was clean. You swore he'd never find the vendors. You told me the old man was too broken to look. Don't you dare put this on me, Preston roared back over the top of her, straining against the agent's grip. You're the one who couldn't wait. You wanted the beach house. You wanted it faster. You're the one who said drain it now while his wife's dying, because you couldn't stand to sit still for one more month. I told you to slow down. I told you. He caught himself, too late, having just confessed the whole thing in front of 2 federal agents and the man he'd robbed. They tore into each other across that table, 2 cornered animals, spitting 19 years of secrets in front of everyone, and I sat quietly at the head of it and let them. I did not need to say a word. I had simply built the room and set the trap and let them walk into it, and now I got to watch them destroy each other with their own mouths. Daniel sat frozen between them, whipping his head back and forth as his marriage and his whole borrowed life detonated at the breakfast table. The affair, the plan, the beach house. He was hearing all of it for the first time, watching the woman he'd betrayed his father for reveal that she'd been another man's the entire time. And then he did the last cowardly thing left in him. He turned to me, tears springing instantly into his eyes, his hands coming up in a pleading, theatrical clasp, and he cried, "Dad, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. She made me do all of it." I reached into my jacket and took out the folded email, and I set it gently on the table in front of him, next to his cold coffee. "You knew, Daniel," I said quietly. "You knew, and you signed, and you asked her to keep you clean so I'd never find out. You didn't know she was planning to leave you with nothing, too. But that's the only thing you didn't know. I let that land. She was going to divorce you the day the papers were signed and disappear with veil. You sold me out to a woman who was already selling you out. That's what your cowardice bought you." He read the email, his own words printed in black and white. I watched his eyes move down the page, watched him reach his own name at the bottom, watched the exact moment the last of his story collapsed. The fight, if you could ever have called it fight, went out of him completely. His shoulders caved. He put his face in his hands and he wept. And this time, the tears were real, ugly and shaking, and without any performance left in them, and I felt nothing at all except a deep, tired, bottomless sadness for the man he could have been, and never once tried to be. "She was going to leave you, Daniel," I said quietly, because he deserved to hear it from me, and not from a prosecutor. "The day the papers were signed, she and Preston had an account you couldn't see, and a divorce lawyer you didn't know about. You sold me out to a woman who was already selling you out. That is the harvest of a coward. You reap exactly what you sow, and you sowed nothing but fear." He didn't answer. There was nothing left in him to answer with. The agents led Vanessa and Preston out through the front door, past the framed photograph of the woman whose house they had tried to steal, out into the cold gray morning where 2 dark cars idled at the curb. Vanessa was still screaming when the door closed behind her, screaming that I'd regret this, that she'd given 20 years to this family, that I owed her. I owed her nothing. I'd given her a son who worshipped her, a home she didn't earn, and a name she never deserved, and she had taken all 3 and tried to turn them into a knife for my back. When the door clicked shut, the screaming was gone, and the house was quiet again, quieter than it had been in a very long time. I did not throw my son out into the street that morning, though God knows I had the right, and God knows Vanessa would have done it to me without a second thought. I am not Vanessa. But I did not let him stay either. Kindness is not the same thing as weakness, and a man who has learned nothing must not be handed the very thing he refused to learn. I took a single sheet of paper from David, and I set it on the table in front of my weeping son, and I told him what it was in a voice that had no warmth left in it, only truth. His employment at Whitmore Development was terminated, effective immediately. Under his mother's bloodline clause, the very clause he himself had named and hidden behind in that email, the clause that stripped any heir who moved against the family, he was disinherited, fully and permanently. He would receive nothing from my estate, not a dollar, not a brick. He had 30 days to find his own place to live, in a home he had never owned and never paid for, and to learn to carry his own weight in a world he had never once had to face without a check from his father. He begged. Of course he begged. He clasped his hands and asked me where he was supposed to go, how he was supposed to live, what he was supposed to do. I looked at my son, 44 years old, and I told him the only true thing I had left to give him. "You can go build a life," I said. The way your mother and I did, from nothing, with your own two hands. Nobody handed us a thing, Daniel, and we did it anyway. Maybe out there, with no one left to protect you and no one left to steal for you, you'll finally become the man she always believed was in there somewhere. I hope you do. But you will not do it in this house, and you will not do it on my money. Then I asked him to leave, and he stood, and he staggered out the front door of his mother's house, a hollow, broken thing. And I did not go to the window to watch him go. But there was one person left in that house I had not forgotten for a single moment. My granddaughter, Sophie. I drove to her friend's house myself to bring her home, and on the drive I told her the truth, all of it, as gently as a hard truth can be told, because she deserved the truth far more than she deserved to be lied to and protected like a child. I told her that her mother and father had done wrong, real wrong, serious enough that they would have to answer for it before the law and be gone for a long time. I watched her small, brave face take it in, watched her understand, watched her cry. And then I told her the thing that mattered more than all the rest of it put together. None of this is yours to carry, Sophie, I said, pulling the truck over so I could look her in the eye. You did not do any of it. You are still my granddaughter. You will always be my granddaughter. And you still have a home, and it is my home, for exactly as long as you want it, which I hope is a very long time. Whatever your parents did, you will never once pay for it, not while I'm breathing. She fell against me across the front seat and sobbed into my shoulder the way she used to when she was small, and I held her. And for the first time since Eleanor died, that big empty house on Linden Hill had a reason to hold someone in it again. 6 months passed. The wheels of justice turned slowly, agonizingly slowly, but they turn all the way around, and when they finish turning, they do not turn back. I sat in the back of that federal courtroom on the day of the sentencing on a hard wooden bench, and I watched the last chapter of their 19-year scheme come to its end. The evidence Marcus had assembled was so clean, so complete, so utterly damning, that there was never any real question of the outcome. Vanessa and Preston were each sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and for the theft of the retirement savings of over 100 working men and women. Vanessa did not scream at the sentencing the way she'd screamed in my dining room. She stood very still in a plain gray jumpsuit, the designer armor stripped away, her sharp haircut grown out and dull, and she looked, for the first time since I'd known her, exactly as small as she truly was. I watched the entire life she had schemed and lied and betrayed for 19 years to build simply evaporate in a judge's single flat sentence, like breath off a cold window. She did not look back at me. There was nothing in her face at all. Preston stood beside her, a hollow shell of the tanned, confident man from the parking garage, his head bowed, his hands cuffed in front of him. They did not look at each other, not once. Whatever had been between them, love or greed, or just the long habit of a shared lie, had curdled into nothing. They had wanted to steal a legacy together. Instead, they were going to spend 15 years apart in separate cages. And that, I thought, sitting on that hard bench, was a kind of justice the law hadn't even intended. My son Daniel found a different kind of sentence, and in some ways a heavier one, because his was not measured in years, but in the rest of his life. Cut off entirely from the money he had never earned and had never once valued, he crashed headfirst into the real world he'd spent 44 years being shielded from. I checked on him exactly once, months later, through Frank Delgado, not out of love, and not out of longing, but out of a simple need to know for certain that the story had truly ended. Frank found him living in a small, thin-walled apartment on the far side of town, the kind of place where you can hear your neighbor's television through the wall. He was working the counter at a big hardware store, wearing a cheap orange vest with his name printed on a plastic tag, answering to a shift manager half his age, cutting keys and mixing paint, and directing customers to aisle 9. For the first time in his life, at 44 years old, my son was learning the exact weight and worth of a dollar he had actually earned with his own two hands. I felt no pity for him. He was reaping precisely the harvest he had spent his whole soft life planting. But I will tell you a secret, the kind of secret a father can't help. A small, foolish, stubborn part of me still hoped that someday, somewhere out there among the 2x4s and the paint cans and the honest sweat, he might finally lay down his cowardice and build something real and become, at last, the man his mother had always believed was hiding somewhere inside him. I don't know if he ever will, but hope is a hard habit to break in a father, even a father who has been betrayed. Eleanor would have wanted me to keep it, and so I keep it. I did not walk away from the wreckage. I never have in my whole life, and I was not about to start at 72. A man who builds does not abandon a house because a storm came through. He surveys the damage, and he rebuilds, stronger than before. The very first call I made was to Ray Coleman. I told him to come home, and I put him back in his chair as a head of construction. And I gave him a raise on top of it and an apology I meant with my whole heart. Then I called the office manager and the estimator, and every single loyal soul Preston Vale had marched out the door to hide his crimes, and I brought them all back with better pay and my personal thanks for the storm they'd weathered without ever knowing why. The soft-handed cronies Preston had hired to look the other way, I let go, quietly and without cruelty. They were only ever symptoms. I had cut out the disease itself. Then came the harder work. Working shoulder to shoulder with Marcus and with Agent Harmon's team, we chased every stolen dollar through the maze of shell companies and offshore routing numbers. And one by one, we pulled it all back. The frozen Cayman account was repatriated in full. And when the money was home, I did the thing I cared about most. I walked into that employee retirement fund myself, with Marcus at my side, and I made every single account whole again, down to the last cent, so that not one truck driver, not one framer, not one crane operator would lose a single dollar of the retirement they had spent their lives earning because of the greed of the people who married into my name. Then I called a meeting of the whole company, everyone, in the big open construction warehouse. And I stood up on a loading dock in front of 100 and some worried faces, and I told them the truth, all of it, what had been taken, who had taken it, and how it had all been made right. And I swore to them, on Eleanor's memory, that as long as there was a Whitmore standing, it would never happen to them again. Looking out over that sea of honest, relieved, work-worn faces, the people who had actually built this thing alongside me, I felt the terrible weight I'd been carrying for a year finally lift clean off my back. And then I did the last thing, the thing that mattered most. On a clear, cold morning, the kind of morning where the sky is so blue it almost hurts, I sat down at Eleanor's oak desk with Marcus and David, and I rebuilt the future the way a builder does, from the foundation up. I took half of everything I owned, half of a life's work, and I put it into the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation. Its purpose was simple, the simplest and truest thing I know. It would find kids who were growing up exactly the way Eleanor and I had grown up, with nothing in their pockets but grit and a stubborn dream, and it would hand them the first brick. Trade school, college, tools, a start. The start nobody ever gave the two of us. The start we had to claw out of the mud with our own bleeding hands. Eleanor believed, right down to the marrow of her, that anybody could build a life if only someone would hand them that first brick and believe they could lay it. Now her name would hand out that first brick to one kid after another, for as long as there is a world to build in. Her name would mean generosity and second chances and honest work, not the greed of the woman who had sat in her chair. Eleanor's name would outlast all of it. The other half of the company I did not leave to any heir at all. I placed it, share by share, into an employee ownership plan so that the men and women who had actually poured the concrete and framed the walls and driven the trucks through the rain would own the very thing they had spent their lives building alongside me. Ray Coleman, the drivers, the estimators, the kid in the yard who'd started sweeping floors last spring. They were the true family of Whitmore Development, and they had earned it 1,000 times over. The empire would not pass to an ungrateful child waiting for an old man to die. It would pass to the people who had actually built it. That is what a legacy is supposed to be. Eleanor taught me that too. Sophie is still living with me. She's applying to colleges now, and she wants to study architecture, if you can believe it, wants to build things. Some nights we sit at Eleanor's oak desk, the desk Vanessa tried to haul out of my office, and Sophie shows me her drawings while I tell her stories about her grandmother, about the flooded lot and the cracked windshield and the cold beans, about how you build something real out of nothing but 2 hands and a promise. They thought they had me. They thought a grieving old man was an easy mark, a signature waiting to be collected, a stone in their path to be kicked out of the way. But they never understood the one thing that made everything else possible. It was never really about the money or the house or even the company. It was about the name on the deed and about who I chose to be when the people I loved tried to take it from me. You can repaint a house any color you like. You can move in your Italian furniture and haul out the old oak desk and pretend the whole thing is yours. But it will never ever change whose name is on the deed. And a man who spent his whole life building things does not forget how to defend the foundation. They tried to put their own father out on the street. They set a stack of papers beside my dinner plate and told me to sign my life away or find somewhere else to live. And they smiled while they said it, because they were certain the quiet old man had nothing left. So I thanked my daughter-in-law for the meal and I went to bed. And in the morning, I called my accountant, and I let the plain, recorded, unarguable truth speak entirely for itself. And by the time Marcus finished reading those ownership records out loud, every single person in that room understood the thing that had been true all along, the thing they were far too arrogant to check. It was not my signature they needed. It was I who held theirs. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is refuse to shout. Sometimes the loudest answer is a quiet one, delivered in the morning, over a cup of coffee, by a voice reading numbers off a page. They wanted a fight. I gave them a fact. Facts do not lose their temper. Facts do not get tired. Facts simply sit there, patient and certain, until the whole house of lies falls down around them. I am still standing. I am still building. Sophie still lives with me, and some evenings we sit together at her grandmother's old oak desk, the desk Vanessa tried so hard to haul out of my office, and Sophie shows me her drawings of houses that don't exist yet, while I tell her stories about the flooded lot, and the cracked windshield, and the cold beans, and the night two young fools drank cheap champagne out of paper cups in a kitchen they'd built with their own hands. She wants to be a builder too. I believe she will be a great one. And somewhere, I have to believe, Eleanor is keeping the books, and watching, and smiling, because after everything, the foundation held. You can repaint a house any color you like. It does not change one letter of whose name is on the deed. And a man who spent his whole life laying foundations does not forget, no matter how old he gets, no matter how much he grieves, exactly how deep his own go. They told me I was finished. They were sure of it, so sure. The quiet ones are broken, they thought. He'll fold, he'll head for the door. But the walls I raised were honest, and the roots run down like stone, and a man who builds his own house always knows it's still his own. I did not raise my voice at them. I did not need to shout. I let the papers do the talking, and the papers spelled it out. Every deed still bore my name. Every brick, every board, the very floor beneath their feet was a thing they'd never owned. So sign it over, they demanded. Sign, old man, or leave. I thanked them for the supper, and I smiled, and I believed that. Come the quiet morning, when the coffee's warm and clear, one phone call reads the record, and the truth rings out sharp and near. I am my Eleanor's husband still, in every board I lay, in every kid we lift up now, in every debt we pay. The world may try to take it, the greedy and the cold, but love that builds an honest thing can never be resold. And when they ask me who I am, this old man they wrote away, I'll set my coffee down and smile, and I will simply say, I am the one who built it. I am the one who stayed. I am the name upon the deed, and the foundation held.